Thanks, and thanks for having me. So, just by way of intro, two things. One is, several of you have asked me what the story with the pants are. And if you pay attention to the Foundry Group website tomorrow or Wednesday, all will be revealed. So just go to foundrygroup.com. It's my hint to those of the people in the world that pay attention to what we invest in. Short background on me. I moved to Boulder in '95. Prior to that, I was an entrepreneur. I had my own company in Boston that I started when I was in school. I was acquired by a public company in 1993. I made about 40 angel investments between 93 and 96. I co-founded a venture capital firm called Mobius Venture Capital in 1996. We funded between 97 and 2005 about 300 companies that were internet related, some very successful, some not. In 2006 and 2007, I made another 40 or so angel investments. And in 2007, I started a new firm with 3 other partners called Foundry Group, which is based here in Boulder. We've made about 55 investments since we started the firm in software internet companies all around the US. Probably one of the most famous ones is Zynga, which we were a very early investor in. We were also a very early investor in a company called AdMeld. It's actually Zynga was our first investment, AdMeld was our second. AdMeld got bought by Google a couple of years ago for about $400 million. About a third of our investments are in Colorado, a third in the Bay Area, and a third everywhere else, so Boston, New York, Portland, Austin, Los Angeles. And we have a lot of fun doing it. The other sort of notable thing about me from an investment perspective is, as Tom said, I co-founded Techstars with David Cohen, and 2 other people, Jared Polis, who's our congressman now, and a guy named David Brown, who was David Cohen's partner in his previous company. We started that business in 2006. Ran our first program in 2007. It's an accelerator program that essentially pioneered the notion of mentor-driven accelerators. We now have a program that we run in Boulder, Boston, New York, Seattle, San Antonio. We also have a white label program we run with Microsoft. So we have several programs a year that we do in Seattle with them. We have about 100 companies a year going through Techstars. We give them a little bit of money and then have this 90-day program with the goal of them coming out of the program as either a bootstrap startup or a funded business. It's pretty exciting. A couple of other background points for me. I've written a handful of books. The most recent one, actually, who has venture deals? There's one of them. It's so nice to see him out in the wild. My partner Jason Mendelson and I wrote a book called Venture Deals, which has turned into one of the definitive guides to raising a round of venture capital. Prior to that, David Cohen and I wrote a book called Do More Faster, which were lessons from Techstars. Recently, the most recent book that I wrote is a book called Startup Communities, how to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem in your city. And I focused a lot of activity around, or a lot of the book around what we've done in Boulder and what's been accomplished in Boulder over the last 20 or so years. And my wife and I have a book that'll be out in January called Startup Life, Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur. So that'll be my most recent book. So that's me. That's the kind of work stuff that I do. The history of this thing called Startup Visa started about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now. And the challenge is a very simple one. Essentially, if you're not a US citizen, it used to be virtually impossible to get a visa to start a company in the US. It's now not virtually impossible, it's mostly impossible. So it's gotten a little bit better, but not a lot better. We discovered this problem in 2007. So 2 of the companies that went through Techstars were founding teams that were not American. They came to Boulder, spent 90 days here in the Techstars program, and then literally couldn't, and had started their companies, but literally couldn't stay in the US after the program was over. 2 of these were Canadian, and 2 were from Europe, France and England. And I always thought the Canadians were really dangerous because they could drink more than us. But it kind of made no sense. And we went through, during the course of the summer, all of the sort of natural process to try to figure out a way to get visas for these guys so they could stay in Boulder. They all wanted to stay in Boulder. And it was literally impossible to do it. And it was fascinating because I'd have these conversations with different lawyers, and they'd all say, oh, yeah, we can figure this out. And then ultimately, there really wasn't a way to figure it out for somebody who was trying to start a company in the US that didn't previously have a visa for being here for some reason. And even if you had a visa for being here for some reason, it, in a lot of cases, wouldn't transfer to you being able to then create a company. Turned out that two guys on the West Coast, a guy named Eric Rees, who wrote a book called The Lean Startup. Eric's really well known now for that, but this was before he was well known. And another friend, a guy named Dave McClure, who has a venture fund called 500 Startups. At the time, he didn't have a venture fund called 500 Startups. The two of them were working on something, or running into the same problem. And we're starting to think about this idea of, is there a way to change one of the existing visa types so that entrepreneurs could get a visa? And essentially, if you wanted to come to the US, you'd be able to get a visa for starting a company in the US. Kind of logical. Turns out there's a visa type called an EB-5 visa that they had discovered that my research also led me pretty quickly to. And an EB-5 visa is the inverse of what you want. So if I'm a foreigner and I invest $1 million in a US-based company, I can get a visa. So essentially, you can buy yourself a visa for $1 million if you have $1 million. But if you're an entrepreneur and you want to come to the US, you're out of luck. So I knew Dave and Eric. We connected. As part of that, we connected with another friend, a fellow named Shervin Pishavar, whose family came over from Iraq in the 70s. Shervin's a successful entrepreneur, now venture capitalist. And this is around 2007, fall of 2007, we started trying to figure this out. I wrote a blog post around it called The Founder's Visa. It got a lot of visibility and a lot of play. And it turned out that Jared Polis was working on, who was a good friend, unbeknownst to me, was working on a broad immigration reform package in the House. Part of Jared's reform package was a reform of the EB-5 to do a number of things, including this particular visa was even though it had been around since the early 1990s, it was still I don't have the right word for it. It wasn't a permanent visa type. So it was a visa type that had a renewal dynamic every couple of years that had to get ratified to continue to go forward. Now the EB-5 had 10, for those of you that don't know how visas work, each visa type has an allocation of number of visas a year. So an H-1B visa, there's 65,000 a year. The EB-5, there were 10,000 a year. And historically, 1,000 or 2,000 EB-5 visas were used. And most of those visas ended up getting processed through these things called the EB-5 regional processing centers, which entrepreneurs started, or people started, I shouldn't say entrepreneurs, typically lawyers started. And what they did was they charged foreign investors $50,000 to take their $1 million and figure out a way to invest it in something and then process their visa. It's kind of this weird scam if you think about it from that perspective. It wasn't really accomplishing much of anything, and it was a relatively easy thing to hack from the standpoint of somebody that wanted to invest in the country. Now, the argument for the EB-5 was this is bringing $1 million investments into the US. Not really material in the grand scheme of things if you think about 1,000 visas a year being translated for this. What Jared wanted to do was he wanted to fix a bunch of loopholes around this, which were good. And he also wanted to add in this concept of allowing the visa to be from somebody who was an entrepreneur who was starting a company in the US. So in 2007, 2008, we worked on a lot of the language around this thing, which we started calling the startup visa. And in the House, this group of us went to Washington. It was actually kind of fascinating to go hang out in Washington for a couple of days and talk to a bunch of folks, both in USCIS, which is Immigration Services, who basically didn't really understand what an entrepreneur was, let alone how to spell the word entrepreneur. And a bunch of people both in the House and the Senate who were kind of mystified by the problem. So you'd sort of describe the problem to someone, and the response would be, at the staff level, would be, I don't really understand the problem, right? And you'd explain the problem again, and they'd still not really understand the problem. So we started doing some grassroots stuff. And early on, we decided we weren't going to hire lobbyists. We weren't going to create a PAC. We weren't going to spend a bunch of money on this. We were just going to see if we could build a movement around this with entrepreneurs and with other people around the entrepreneurial ecosystem, which would include VCs and angel investors, et cetera. Had a bunch of case studies. We started working on these situations and making more noise about it, and sort of running into this situation over and over again where every time something would come out, and this is 2008-ish, drifting into early 2009, every time something would come out about this and the tempo was picking up, I would get inbound from a whole bunch of lawyers who would basically call me a crackpot. And they'd say, you know, this is ridiculous. You know, I've been doing immigration law for 25 years. It's really easy to get these visas. All you need to do is spend $25,000 and da-da-da-da. And at the end of the discussion, I took about, I don't know, 20 calls over a 6-month period. And every single call started off the same way, and every single call ended the same way, which is, you're right, you can't get a visa for that. It's unbelievable. And really, you know, the problem was a very well-defined one, which is you have somebody who's in the US or who wants to come to the US, who wants to start a business, and they literally can't get a visa to come. And interestingly, even people who had valid visas, if they left the US, they were getting stopped at the border by CBP and not let back into the country because CBP didn't understand what an entrepreneur was. They basically thought it was somebody who was broke and was a burden on society, right? And so you'd have these stories of these people that actually had companies in the US, and they might be a co-founder, they might not be the only founder, but they'd go home and they try to come back and they couldn't get re-entry into the country because they get stuck, and their visa would be declared invalid or it would be suspended subject to whatever. This problem sort of recurred over and over and over again. 2009, we got some legislation drafted by Polis on the House side and Zoe Lofgren, and on the Senate side by Lugar and John Kerry. And then Mark Udall, our senator, ended up co-sponsoring it. And these two bills were very similar, and they were basically modifying the EB-5 bill, or the EB-5 visa, to not add more visas, but to allow the up to 10,000 visas a year to be used for entrepreneurs. And the qualification for a valid application would be that you had to raise $250,000 per founder to get the visa. So if you had 3 founders, you had to raise $750,000, 1 founder, $250,000. So there was kind of the minimum threshold that we could, you know, the answer wasn't it couldn't be 0. You had to have some threshold. But you, the entrepreneur, were raising the money versus investing it. And then you had to create 5 jobs within 2 years. That's it. Relatively low threshold. Obviously not solving the problem generically, right? The problem, we weren't trying to solve all the edge cases. We're trying to solve this sort of clear middle case of entrepreneurs who were not able to get visas. I learned a lot about drafting legislation through this process. So there were a handful of us, me included, that were on the front lines of trying to make sure the legislation got drafted correctly. As we're going through things with, for example, the House Judiciary Committee, the sort of laborious process of explaining to somebody on a conference call that had 9 other people exactly what the words meant, and then getting back, if you've ever seen a draft bill, sort of in the formatting of a bill, which is like, it's on an 8.5 by 11-inch piece of paper, but it's got about 40 words per page. And it's almost incomprehensible. It's like a logic diagram to try to understand. You have to draw it out to understand exactly what it's saying. And it refers to a bunch of stuff that doesn't exist in the bill that you have to go find if you want to actually understand what it means. Just that whole process was, frustrating and tedious. And then you learn that actually having a bill drafted is meaningless. It literally means nothing. And that the process from having a bill drafted to getting a bill even to the point where it gets considered is this long process that, for those of you that remember Saturday morning cartoons, I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill, that turns out to be exactly correct. Like, it's really, really hard to take this bill and move it to anything. And in both cases, the Senate bill and the House bill, in 2009, they went nowhere. Just like no attention paid to them. It turned out in the House, what's her name? Nancy Pelosi had a lockdown view that the only kind of thing we want to move on immigration is everything. So we're not doing any piecemeal, anything related to immigration, regardless of what it has to do with anything. Our bill we were trying to position as a jobs bill, not as an immigration bill, well before jobs bills were popular. And it was your immigration, therefore, unless it's part of comprehensive immigration reform, we're not interested. The Republicans wanted nothing to do with immigration. and any kind of immigration reform. So their tactic was, we just don't care, we're not listening. On the Senate side, it was even more bizarre. On the Senate side, the Democrats, again, comprehensive immigration reform, and the Republicans were very focused on, oh, we're going to like find a thing like that startup visa thing, and we'll pass that, and then we'll say we've done some immigration stuff. And so the Democrats are like, well, we won't pass any of that stuff because we don't want to give the Republicans even like a little bit of something unless they're willing to do everything. And our little stupid bill was one of the ones that was being discussed, and then all of a sudden the Democrats are like, no, 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 we don't want that. It's 2009. End of the session comes, the bills all die. It's like they delete the hard drive at the end of the session. And so 2010 comes, and it took about 3 months to get the two bills redone and re-entered. And basically the same thing happened in 2010. So nothing happened either year. At this point, though, what is going on is the White House, and I've got a bunch of linkages to the White House through Phil Weiser at CU, who is at this point in the Obama administration. Anish Chopra, who is the CTO, and I had become friends because of a couple things we're doing together. I had gotten involved in this thing called Startup America and the Startup America Partnership, which was happening in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I wasn't spending a lot of time in Washington, but I had these linkages in, and I was interacting with folks, and people were coming to me because I was actually one of the few, probably venture capitalists, that was sort of willing to, in a direct one-on-one conversation without, a partisan dynamic, just say what was on my mind. And the White House started to get interested in trying to figure out what they could do around this without the change in the law. So the dynamics broadly about how this works is that our immigration laws are written by Congress and then interpreted by USCIS. So if the law changes, USCIS, Immigration Service, changes what they do. But if the law doesn't change, USCIS still has a potential to interpret the law in a different way. It's a gigantic bureaucracy, so almost by definition, it's got a lot of flexibility in how it interprets the law. And even more importantly, the implementation of how it interprets the law is very difficult because it's not interpreted necessarily just by some group in a building. Every time you cross over the border, it's being interpreted by the dude sitting in the booth that's deciding whether or not to let you cross over the border. Now, we don't have this problem because we're all American citizens, but if you're a Canadian and you've got your stack of papers and you're trying to get into the US on your visa, and the guy starts leafing through your stack of papers and he asks you a question like, what do you do? And you say, I'm an entrepreneur. And he says, well, what is an entrepreneur? You're screwed, right? And so, there's all of this kind of friction at the border. So one of it is interpretation of the law. The other is the implementation of the interpretation of the law. So two things happened in the last 12 months that made essentially what was a pretty untenable situation less sucky. One of them is that the White House essentially made a series of pronouncements through Immigration Service about a change in interpretation of some of the laws. And an example would be that up until this point, you could not have an H-1B, you could not own the company be an owner of the company that gave you the H-1B visa. So if you got an H-1B visa, you could not be an owner of the company. I'm a founder of a company. I can't have my company sponsor me. It's ridiculous. So now you can have your company sponsor you and go through that process. However, if your company fails, your visa is immediately revoked. Okay? Now you have a 6-month grace period in that situation, so you can figure something out for those 6 months before they haul you out and chuck you out of the country. But things like that, there are a handful of these changes in the interpretation. They also figured out a way at the beginning of this year. They had some money, and they created an EIR program, Entrepreneur in Residence program, within USCIS, with the idea of having 5 entrepreneurs spend 90 days within Immigration Services and understand how things were being implemented, sort of do their own inside-out view of things. And these entrepreneurs did a really useful job. They would do things like go sit at the border crossing and watch how things were being interpreted. They spent time with the people who were adjudicating these visas, and they understood what they were looking for and what they were getting hung up on. And they've made a series of things which have been rolled out sort of, in some ways, been more impactful than others. They also elevated the problem pretty clearly within CIS, the last thing that happened was a few of the visa types that you could essentially use if you're an entrepreneur, the most significant one being an O visa type, which is an extraordinary individual. The O visa type was created for movie stars and sports figures. So if you're a movie star and a sports figure, you can get an O visa. If you're an entrepreneur, you can't. And the O visa is now being used for entrepreneurs, and it's a difficult one to get, but it's one that's being used more commonly for these situations. Last thing sort of in the story, and then sort of go wherever you guys want in terms of, I'll give a punchline and then go wherever you guys want in terms of Q&A, is one of the interesting challenges sort of in this whole arc has been this idea of what to do in the context of this. And one thing that came out in the Jobs Act and is being talked about a lot now, sort of there's something called the Startup Act, which the Jobs Act was part of. The next version of the Startup Act 2.0 is what people are talking about, which if Obama gets reelected will probably be front of the agenda. If Romney gets elected, it'll probably get a deep sixth right away. Is this notion that we're doing this really perverted thing with higher ed. So most higher college universities and both public and private institutions, especially public institutions, need foreign students because they pay full freight. So the foreign students come to CU, they get a degree, undergraduate or graduate degree, but they pay full rates. They don't pay the Colorado rates, they don't get financial aid, they don't get student loans, some do, but most don't. And essentially they're needed for two reasons. One is pure financials, and the other is a quota dynamic. So many of the universities have a quota dynamic around diversity. It's not just diversity within the US, it's not just diversity within gender and race, it's diversity internationally. So they want to get people from around the world to come to the university. Especially true in private universities, but also true in public universities. These students go through school, and guess what? They can't get a visa to stay here. And we just ship them back home. It's especially true of master's and PhD students. It's just ridiculous. And so there's a thing that's been going on. Lots of people are taking credit for the line right now, so I'm perfectly happy for lots of people to take credit for the line, which is that the statement that every diploma for somebody who has a STEM degree, science, tech, engineering, or math, should get a green card staple to their diploma. Some hippie entrepreneur said that a couple of years ago. Now lots of people are saying that. And it's a good thing, but the challenge is there's a whole immigration infrastructure and a whole bunch of people who don't have green cards that have different types of visas that are offended by the idea that somebody might get a visa ahead of them. Right? So you have all of these weird problems because we have this complex system. And the punchline is, a lot of people have asked me, what's the solution to it? And it's not entirely clear that there's a solution that's a near-term solution to it. It's kind of like the same problem we have with tax law, the same problem we have with patent law. Like, we have these things that are so messed up that it's not like you can sort of fix one part of it. You can fix one part of it and make it maybe incrementally better, but you've got to fight so hard to get that incrementally better that until the system implodes, we're really, we have a stressful dynamic. I don't know what causes the system to implode. Part of the thing that's so powerful about the US democracy is that it's not intended to move quickly on these implosions, right? So you have this pendulum that swings back and forth, but it sort of finds its balance. It goes too far one direction, and it starts getting pulled the other direction. So we're sort of stuck in this situation around immigration. And the thing that's so disheartening to me as an investor and as somebody who's an entrepreneur is that if you look at entrepreneurship in the US and you look at the dynamics of companies today and leadership of great companies today, about 50% of all the great technology companies have either an immigrant founder or a founder who is the son or daughter, a child of an immigrant. Virtually half of all major technology companies. And so it's kind of mind-bending to think that we're in a position where we're making that difficult. But I don't know what the solve is. So, you know, we'll try again after this election cycle. Jobs will be front of mind again. Who knows whether immigration reform will have any impact. The nice thing is it's no longer a Brad Feld, Eric Ries, Dave McClure, and a couple of other people thing. It's a very, very broad movement. You know, Thomas Friedman has taken it on as one of his causes, and a bunch of other people who have a lot more political influence and, frankly, political stamina are putting energy into it. And, you know, my hope is in the next, you know, 2 to 4 years, we'll see some structural change. My instinct is that the first structural change we'll see is with the graduate program degrees. I think that should be easy and non-controversial once people get out of this election cycle, given the amount of momentum behind that. I think the figuring out how to get entrepreneurs the ability to have a visa and start their companies here is a harder one for a lot of people to figure out and to stomach. And again, all these, well, if they're going to do that, then I need this. The last point I make is an example of that is when we started talking about the EB-5 as a solve, all the people that were these EB-5 regional centers started talking about how bad we were as people and how we were trying to take away their livelihood, which was processing these EB-5 visas, right? So it's this very bizarre situation where when you have something, even if it doesn't make any sense, you try to hang on to it in this dynamic versus sort of step back. And I had a couple of conversations with these folks. I'm like, you know, you're only using 1,000 of these a year. We're not asking to take your 1,000 away. And frankly, if you use 5,000 a year, we'll take whatever's left. You get priority. Well, no, that's not how it's going to work. And so you have this interesting dynamic where everybody's agenda trumps what's going on. So that's the experience I've had. It's been a very useful journey for me. I'd never spent much time on national politics, nor do I plan to. And I'm a big believer in the way you learn stuff is to do something and go really deep on it. Because it's easy to look at it from the outside. It's a whole different thing when you actually experience it. Part of the writing books for me is also that of going deep on a particular topic. And in this particular case, or this specific case, I learned enough about the dynamics in Washington around getting laws moved that I have a good understanding of it now, and I don't feel compelled to continue to beat my head against it as a primary focus. But it's been a useful journey. That's the story. Happy to talk about anything around this or whatever else you want to talk about. Go ahead.
Brad, you mentioned that the legislation that was proposed would be $250,000 per founder in order to get the startup visa. That seems a lot like the original EB-5 where the founder put in $1 million. Why wouldn't you be able to just say, well, let's go out and raise $1 million to bring in the entrepreneur?
No, that's what it is. So the entrepreneur didn't have to put in $250. It was the entrepreneur had to create a company, and for each entrepreneur, they had to raise $250. Yeah. So,
but if that exists now?
Doesn't exist.
But the $1 million investment?
The $1 million, the person who gets the visa is the foreign investor, not the entrepreneur. It's the opposite of what you'd want, which is what we were trying to solve for.
Well, one obvious solution is to put the EB-5 guys together with the guys that you have, and somehow, I guess you're saying you still have to have legislation to allow your guys to match up with those EB-5 guys.
Yeah, the EB-5. Let me try it again.
Let's the guy who makes the
I'm an entrepreneur. I'm from Chile.
Right.
I have no money. I have an idea to start a company. I want to start a company in Boulder, Colorado.
Right.
I cannot get that visa.
Right.
If somebody from Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. If somebody from Russia wants to invest $1 million in my company,
right,
they can invest $1 million and get a visa. I still can't get a visa.
Right.
Okay? So that guy from Chile who has no money but is an entrepreneur, whether he has foreign investors lined up or US investors, Foundry Group wants to invest $1 million in his company, he can't get a visa. That's the problem we're trying to solve. Go ahead.
Just thinking out loud, with all the entrepreneurial people here, what legalistic kinds of things could be done? You have an entrepreneur, you have a millionaire investor, somehow the entrepreneur has the money, and there's some legal agreement between him and the investor, so that the entrepreneur with now $1 million comes into the country.
Yeah, so that happens a little bit. The problem is the $1 million investor from outside the country doesn't want to do that because the reason the $1 million investor is investing in the US company is to get their visa. The US investor won't give the money to a foreigner. A US investor just simply won't do that, right? You want to invest in a company. So there's kind of no mechanism, and we look through a bunch of legal mechanisms for creating a loan structure to the entrepreneur. There's something called an L visa, which is after a year, if you start a company in a foreign country, you can create a US subsidiary and get a visa to come travel for the US subsidiary. And essentially all of those visa dynamics get invalidated by USCIS. Like they view those as all sham transactions. So, you know, we sort of exercised a bunch of those, you know, like how can we function this way? And they just don't, you know, they don't work, or structurally it's, if I'm a US investor and I'm in the business of investing in companies, which is what I am, I'm not going to loan somebody or give somebody the money. Right. And oh, by the way, if you're a US investor and you give a foreigner $1 million, that's a whole different set of issues with the Patriot Act that you've now got to deal with. Because of the amount of money that you'd potentially be transferring to somebody, and what's the ownership, and da-da-da-da-da. Yeah. So it's a good point, but it's just, again, I felt like we edge tested all that stuff and couldn't get there.
Yeah, I thought you might have considered that. As an entrepreneur, we tend to look for how do you get around things that are in our way.
Yeah.
Now, with that in mind, you mentioned this book about startup life.
Yeah.
And so another thought that came to mind was, here are these graduates, and somehow or another, you, your wife, some company, it's like an entrepreneurialmatch.com. And these people end up married and end up with visas, and somehow everyone gets taken care of in the process. And we know that over half the marriages don't last. So, I mean, this is, you know, pragmatic. It's not about, you know, all these people go out of the country and then the money helps their country. So can't someone that marries here stay here?
Entrepreneurial trafficking.
Yeah, so arranged marriages, there is an interesting issue around that, which is the legality of actually trying to create arranged marriages for something like that. My sense is that there's probably state level laws around that would be hard to actually execute on. I don't have any idea whether it's true or not, but my instinct is that it would be a very difficult thing to actually do legally, and even if you could do it
legally. Of course not. I mean, it's something that happens under the covers. No one is saying anything to anybody, but these people fall in love, they get married, and who's to say that wasn't true?
It's a fabulous idea. Sounds like a movie.
Yeah.
Not something like my view of this, and this is part of the thing that I approached it with. I'm actually not interested in trying to solve this not legally, because I think if you can't solve it legally, it doesn't scale. And I think part of the issue is not solving for one person or two people or five people. It's trying to figure out something that scales. Actually, I think you're conflating a couple things. So let me take them both. The second, so the dynamics for the visa are, again, the proposed language was you have a 2-year visa. If your business fails, you still have that period of time to get a renewed visa, you know, to essentially, you could raise another $1 million. So the threshold test for all the visa, maintaining your visa, is that you're not a burden on society. So as long as an entrepreneur you're not a burden on society, from that test, theoretically you should be able to stay in the country through whatever that period of time is. Now, if I'm a foreign citizen on a visa, I actually can't go on welfare. Like there's a whole series of US things that I can't do, or you can legislate that you can't, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're not a burden on society, right? So that's the argument. My experience is that the vast majority of qualified entrepreneurs, so assume not bad intent, assume a good intent, the vast majority of those entrepreneurs are almost by definition not burdens on society because they're trying to create something from nothing, and it's a net add to the system. The argument against it is the first thing that you said, which is, well, they're competing with Americans for jobs. And I've heard this over and over again, or they're competing with Americans for capital. So we don't want to let those foreigners into Boulder or into our country because they might compete with a Boulder person.
Excuse me, I like the way you separated Boulder from our country.
That's fine. But the point is that argument is the argument you hear over and over again. My reaction to it is a completely specious argument for two reasons, right? One is, if you look at the country philosophically, we're looking for job creators. Entrepreneurs are job creators. They're taking nothing and turning it into jobs. That nothing might include a small amount of capital, but they're generating net positive jobs. That's thing number one, and that's well documented, not just for immigrant entrepreneurs, but for the vast majority of net job creation over the last 30 years has come from companies that are less than 5 years old. So good understanding that the net job creation in this country comes from new companies being created. The second is that we are nowhere near the consumption, or consumption is the wrong word, saturation of entrepreneurial activity. So the idea that it's a zero-sum game, that there's a fixed pool of resources that entrepreneurs are fighting over is completely illogical. And in fact, it's kind of the opposite, is that to make progress as a country, we actually need a lot more entrepreneurial energy, not less. So sort of the logical path of both of those kind of gets you to the same place, but those are both, I mean, they're very good, very common sort of counter arguments. Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is that the first one, which is the zero-sum game argument, I would say most politicians get that pretty quickly. Like, they understand that entrepreneurship and new company creation is such a small percentage of our overall economy that there's enormous room for more of it, and that we need a lot more of it, not just from the perspective of moving our economy forward, but also from the perspective of having innovation in the system. That's relatively easy. The burden on society one is more complicated because you get into these weird arguments, and most of the weird arguments become sort of intellectual immigration arguments. And they sort of default into, you know, that the illegal alien that's working in a field somewhere, you know, doing something, and ends up getting hurt and ends up in the hospital and using healthcare dollars because they're in the hospital and somebody has to take care of them. And they take care of them first because that's what hospitals do. And then they try to figure out, oh shit, this person doesn't have insurance. Oh, they're an illegal. Oh, there's nobody to get the money from. And off you go, right? That's such a different category of burden on society than we're dealing with in this situation, especially if those entrepreneurs have been funded by US-based investors. So most of my discussions around that, also when I talk to people, you know, again, staffers or politicians, they generally get through that pretty quickly. The people that get hung up on that are mostly the immigration lawyers and the policy wonks who want to have this sort of theoretical discussion about it rather than the practical, what does it actually really mean, and what are we talking about in terms of the character of these types of people?
Entrepreneurs, is there a way, if you have an American company and you want to bring someone in and hire them from another country, can you do that?
H-1B visa.
Okay. So,
but it didn't used to be the case that you could hire somebody in H-1B. It's expensive and non-trivial, so a lot of startups don't do it. Second, there's a cap on H-1Bs, and so there's a limit a year, and those caps tend to get filled very, very quickly, especially right now.
okay.
So today the cap on H-1Bs are getting filled in a matter of weeks. There have been periods of time in down cycles where you might not hit the cap, right? And so there's another argument that we should double the number of H-1Bs, and then you get into this whole thing, well, if you're doubling the number of H-1Bs, then I need some more for this or that or the other thing. But, you know, but that's really the, you know, but you can't, this solves the hiring problem, but then once you're here on an H-1B, you have to work for that company.
Right.
You can't go work for somebody else, and you can't leave and start your own business. So your visa is not valid. If IBM hires me, I'm from India, IBM hires me, I move to Boulder, I work in the IBM Research Center in Longmont on an H-1B. I'm here for 3 years, I'm doing a great job. I meet a friend, his name is Joe. Joe and I decide to start a business. I can't leave IBM.
Right.
If I leave IBM, my H-1B is invalid, I'm back to India.
Right. Well, what I'm looking at is not the major solution, but a partial one in which you have an entrepreneur from another country, local people, investors, start a company, they hire this entrepreneur to be part of the company, and then he gets promoted and runs the company.
Well, he could run the company, but he would have zero equity. So until recently, he couldn't own any share of the company at all.
Yeah.
So that's not really an entrepreneur, that's an employee.
Yeah.
Now, the change that USCIS did this summer, or the White House did this summer, allows you to get an H-1B for a company that you're an owner in.
Okay.
So that was already in the law, and the interpretation changed. So now you could do that if it's your own company. Your company could hire you, and you can get an H-1B, except for there's a cap on H-1Bs.
Yeah.
They're non-trivial to get, right? Dot, 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 dot.
Okay.
Right.
Is there an ownership limit on, can you be 100% owner?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I believe you can be 100% owner now. I don't think you have to have other owners. Yeah, I think the chance of something getting passed in the next 4 years is much higher than it was in the last 4 years. I do think that it's going to be interesting because there is a lot of sense that if Obama is elected again, that he's going to push very, very hard on the all or nothing solutions around things like immigration.
That's what Jobs said.
Yeah.
Obama told him to do.
Yeah, which,
All or nothing.
and that's the mistake, right? Because the all or nothing solutions don't actually happen. So essentially, this particular thing has been repositioned or recast primarily as jobs-related activity versus immigration-related activity, with still this, you know, it's in immigration, so it sort of falls under that. I don't have a sense as to whether or not anything actually happens, but I do agree that I think the chance in the next 4 years is much better than in the last 4 years, regardless of who's president. So, go ahead, and then you in the back.
But what have you learned about the legislation process that you wish you knew when you started?
A couple of things. I am really proud of the fact that we haven't spent a dime on this. And it's reinforced very strongly my belief that one of the things that has completely screwed up our legislation process is money. The group of us that have been working on this have lots of money. So we easily could have put together a lot of money and tried to do something. And that didn't seem right to any of us. Like, it just was illogical. It was an utter waste of money to pay the people. Oh, by the way, many of whom constantly said, if you pay me some money, I can help you. There was an awful lot of that. And there was an awful lot of, you're not going to make any progress unless you pay these people some money. Here's what you got to do, and here's what it's going to cost. So there was like this whole, like you kind of knew it without being on the inside. And now all of a sudden you're on the inside and you're like, my God, this is ridiculous. Like it's not about logic. It's not about good of society. It's about who's greasing what. And you kind of know that, but until you see it and until you're really in the middle of it. So that was a thing that was, I don't know that would have changed my behavior, but you know, there was a little bit of, not naivete, just frustration with the amount of it that you ran into. I mean, we knew it was there, but just the amount of it over and over and over again. Thing number two was I did not really understand how, I don't have the right word for it. It's not partisan politics. Politics is all about, or political progress and lawmaking is all about trades. And they're trades, you give me this, I'll give you that. And again, you intellectually know that until you're in a conversation with the general counsel and the government affairs person for a major technology company who should badly want this. And they say, what's in it for me? Major technology company. You say, what do you mean what's in it for you? This is like good for you. Well, if I go out on the limb for this, what are you going to give me? I'm like, I got nothing to give you. I'm just some dude like trying to help you make some progress here. Like, and if you only heard that one time, it would be like, okay, right? Over and over and over again, what's in it for me? Versus, and people would, I'd say, do you disagree with the logic of what we're saying? No, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And we could completely support it, but what's in it for me? And they weren't necessarily looking for money. They're looking for, you know, what kind of air cover are you going to give me? Or if I do this, what kind of other support? Or I need you to come out publicly against this, about this thing over here that we're fighting with. You got to be giving me, seriously? So that was 2. 3 is, I should say I have an enormous amount of respect for our 2 senators. I think Bennett and Udall are both very competent and very smart. And they're willing to think about the issues. So they don't necessarily, I don't agree with everything for both of them, but they're willing to engage in a conversation to try to understand what's going on. There were many other people on the Senate side who I could not say that about that I interacted with, including some who were just discouraging humans. Like, they just weren't smart, and they just weren't interested in trying to understand it. You could disagree with me, but at least try to understand it. Congress, on the House side, way worse. Completely disappointing. The conversations, including the kind of continued blow-off from representatives, not in Colorado. I mean, Colorado is very easy. Like, if you're a Democrat, it's easy to get, if you're from Boulder, it's easy to get the Democrats' attention in Colorado. It's impossible to get the Republicans. It's a very partisan place. California, like, the long list of people in California that should be paying attention to this that don't want to because it complicates their universe. And we had a very funny experience. I won't name.
What way it complicates the universe?
Because they already have all kinds. I mean, we're in Colorado.
Enough on their plate.
They have enough on their plate. They have all kinds of immigration issues anyway. They have all these constituency dynamics. The last thing in the world they want to do is like try to take on anything else. They just want like keep it away from me because I don't want to have to deal with anything else. So we're in the Hart building, which is a nice building. And there's an elevator. There's 2 elevators. There's an elevator over on this side, and an elevator over on this side. It's not that tall a building, like 6 floors. And the elevator on this side looks like a normal elevator. Elevator on that side has a little sign on top that says Congressmen only. It doesn't say congressmen and congresswomen only. It says congressmen only. A little sign on the top of the elevator with a little red light. I'm with this group, and three of the people were from California. And one of their representatives in the House wanders up, and they recognize this person. And one of them goes over to the person and says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I voted for you. I'm in your district. Can I get 5 minutes to talk to you about this thing that we're here talking to?" And he named off a couple of other people in the House and the Senate. And this particular person literally said no and walked in the elevator that said Congress people only, and that was the end of discussion. Right? And it wasn't, okay, I got it. I mean, I have people come up to me all the time and, hey, can I talk to you? But just the abruptness of it was so unnerving in the context of it. And this was somebody who we tried to get on their calendar. And so, you could say, well, okay, a bunch of crazy people in the building, but we're in the building already. It wasn't like we were outside the building. We went through the X-ray detectors. We were clear. We had an escort. So just very, like, that sort of oddity of the system, which is theoretically not how it's supposed to work. Right? So I could give more stories like that, but those are probably the big ones. The lack of interest of a certain set of people who should be interested, or lack of willingness to engage in the actual problem. The all or nothing thing, which I talked about earlier, was probably the last, which I didn't really understand this. I kind of thought that both sides would be interested in incremental solutions that actually materially improved the system. And they only were willing to do that if it served their purpose of undermining the other side, which makes no sense.
Brad, how much time would an entrepreneur need to spend in the country? And I'm thinking in terms of some kind of an earn-in process where they could come into the country for a couple of weeks, go back, start the business while they're here, and then as the value of the company increases, could they potentially get to a point where they could buy their visa?
Probably not, for 2 reasons. One is, pragmatically, I don't think that's how most startups work anyway. But assuming that tempo worked, remember, it costs money to fly in and out of the country too, so you're dealing with like the added overhead of all of that. One of the biggest concerns that happened as we were working to draft the original legislation was everywhere we turned, both House and Senate Judiciary Committee people that I talked to were completely obsessed with loopholes. Like all they wanted to do was focus on how to shut the bad actors down. They didn't want to assume good intent. They wanted to assume bad intent. So in some ways it was like defensive law versus, you know, trying to do something on a positive side. And anything that involved multiple steps or multiple adjudication created a problem. And it's especially challenging with what we learned with CBP, you know, with Border Patrol, is that CBP's interpretation is the first line of the problem. Many of the people who get stuck at CBP have valid visas, and they literally can't get back in the country because of the interpretation. And so then there's a fear that gets created associated with it, because these stories, of course, people, you know, they're entrepreneurs. They have lots of friends that are entrepreneurs. They reach out to, they write a blog about it, but they're kind of afraid to talk too publicly about it because CBP has all this data, right? So, you know, people say, I saw, you know, the guy was going through my file and he says, you wrote this blog post about blah, blah, blah.
We're not letting you in.
Yeah, forget it. You know, you're out. Bye. You know, so that kind of thing plays out over and over again. And part of the thing the White House has tried to do with this mid-year thing is fix some of those problems. And I think actually they've made some progress. So it's not awful, but it's still pretty bad.
So I heard you talk a little bit about maybe scaling up from the specific problem you're working on up to the graduate student problem. Are there other parts of the problem you think kind of fit in nicely with the...
No, the two really...
It's a two-part question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the second part is this seems to be a function of 911. And,
yeah.
you know, one of the... Pardon me, but Osama bin Laden was a genius. The things he's made us do to ourselves, and this is one of those things. Are there other things that you can get around like this?
Well, first is the two big things are the graduate student visa, so it's called stapling now, so it's got a name, right? Stapling a green card to the diploma, and the entrepreneur's visa or the startup visa. Those are the two things that seem to have bipartisan support and are relatively uncontroversial in intellectual vacuum. Implementation of how to do it's a different issue. I have not run into other things that I would put in those categories. Even things like expanding H-1B broadly in terms of number, very, very controversial, because there's a whole bunch of people that believe it's essentially insourcing inexpensive labor. So